All right, great. Well, I have 11 a.m. and it's time to get started. So today's Lunch and Learn topic is volunteer utilization. I have Charles Hebert on the call today. He's going to co-present with me. I'm going to cover about the first half of today's session, discussing some volunteer utilization topics, and then Charles is going to take it away from the agent perspective and some things that they've done in their parish heading into the fall. So thank you, Charles, for being on the call today.
Glad to be here.
Right. So quick overview, Lunch and Learn. This is our fourth session of 5 for the summer series. Every third Thursday at 11 a.m., combination of presentation and discussion. We do produce the digital badges, and you can access the previous sessions at the link that I will send out after the call today and also on your screen. Also, there was a request to make a volunteer development resource sharing Microsoft Teams, and we did create that. If you attended the 2-hour workshop on volunteer recruitment that we just got through about 2 weeks ago, I shared the link to that. So if you want to go ahead and add yourself to that team, share any resources you find, you look in there every week. I'm going to share other materials with you as well. There's a series of webinars that I just recently shared, so feel free to add yourself to that team. So today's agenda, we're going to discuss what volunteer utilization means, some of the strategies for effectively using our volunteers, and discuss the delegation responsibilities and those kind of the resistance that we sometimes have when delegating responsibilities to our volunteers and to others. We're going to dive into a little bit of utilizing volunteers in a remote environment, and then Charles is going to take it away and discuss some of the things that he's done to implement effectively use volunteers in his parish, and then also just discussing the current climate that we're in as well. So he's got a lot of information he's going to share with you today. And then I've got some volunteer utilization kind of tips and tools that I want to share with you in the last half, just as we move into the fall, resources and tools that can help you and save you a lot of time when it comes to developing your program. So we talk about utilization. So in our ISOTURE method of effective volunteer management that we often refer to. So utilization is providing those opportunities for your volunteers to put their knowledge and skills into appropriate action. We're going to discuss some of the barriers that don't allow our volunteers to lead and how we can eliminate those barriers. Potentially the communication channels that we have to employ in making proper utilization of volunteers and allow them to be empowered and assume those leadership roles. And what kind of structure that we need to have in place ongoing, and then also right now, moving into some of these hybrid and remote environments, how can we keep tabs on our volunteers, communicate effectively with them, and then also allow them to have a voice in our program so that they feel valued and we have a better opportunity or chance to retain them in the future. So earlier this year, when we talked a little bit about volunteer engagement, I'll say a little bit, it was a 90-minute session during Back to the Future. We discussed volunteer engagement and the volunteer engagement survey. And I showed you the community partner matrix and how you can use that matrix to create strong volunteer partnerships, or how it relates to strong volunteer partnerships. And so within that matrix, we have these 5 levels, starting from a lower level of outreach, that kind of relationships with our volunteer where we're leading, but we're sending them information. Communication is really one way, and the 4-H program is leading. And then moving all the way into that kind of volunteer driven. So I talked about this matrix and I got some feedback in that evaluation about it. And somebody asked me to provide them with real examples of how I can retain my volunteers using the community partner matrix. So I wanted to revisit it today because some of the communication that I've had recently, some good and some bad, but when we talk about issues with retainment and utilization of volunteers, a lot of the same, I'm hearing a lot of the same things. So I talk a lot about communication, how communication needs to be two-way between the organization and the volunteer. Talking about giving that volunteer a voice, allowing that volunteer to tell you what their needs are, and having shared leadership in your program. When it comes to increasing that partnership or that relationship with your volunteer, if you're moving further into the shared leadership or volunteer-driven type of partnership, you're going to have an increased level of volunteer involvement. They're going to feel like they're making a larger impact because they're more involved. There's a greater degree of trust, all right, and respect, and in communication. And so in the situation we're in right now, you've had a lot of months where our programs have been very different and we haven't had an opportunity to communicate with our volunteers regularly. And so if we haven't been communicating with them, if we haven't found a way to involve them, or at least share with them the situations that we're in with our programs, we have a less chance of actually retaining them. And so the key to moving across this community partner matrix and developing those strong partnerships is that communication that's bidirectional. So we're giving them information, but we're capturing their needs as well. We're giving them a voice in our program, and there's that visible partnership and relationships that's developed between us and volunteers. So we're not just sending them the information that we need for them to lead our programs, but we're also capturing what resources they need from us in order to effectively lead. And that is, in doing that, we need to establish these relationships. There need to be trust. There needs to be respect. And so if you're looking for answers in developing these relationships, think about how you can allow your volunteers to have a voice in your program, thinking about how you can employ these two-way communication channels, how you can share with them the impact that they are doing, establishing trust, and then learning how to treat each other with respect. And you're going to move, you'll see gradually over time, those relationships take a lot of time to evolve. And that's why I think it's really important to have Charles on the call today so he can talk about some of the ways that he's been able to move into that shared leadership or volunteer-driven relationship with his volunteers. All right, so now I'm normally a very high-tech person. I like to involve a lot of technology tools, but right now I just want you to take out a pen and paper and answer these questions for me using yes, no, or sometimes. So this is our volunteer utilization checklist. All right, so it's 5 very simple questions that I want you to be honest about. So do you, number 1, support volunteers in carrying out their responsibilities as outlined in their volunteer position descriptions? So yes, no, or sometimes. Next question, do you provide volunteers with opportunities to use their skills and talents and follow their interests? Or are you just placing them in, the open roles that you have? Yes, no, sometimes. All right, our third question is, do you offer continuous training and provide volunteers with opportunities to apply their knowledge and skills? So continuous training, opportunities to apply knowledge and skills. Yes, no, sometimes. Question 4, do you supervise your volunteers and provide them with feedbacks on their feedback on their efforts? Yes, no, sometimes. And then question 5, do you allow volunteers to evaluate the program and provide you with feedback? Yes, no, sometimes. All right, so now if you feel like if you want to share, what did you get? How many yeses did you have? How many sometimes do you have? So somebody share in the chat. You can share openly as well. You did the checklist, so what were your results? So Adriana said 1 yes and 4 sometimes. Okay, thank you for being honest. I appreciate. So Adriana, where were you at? What was your yes?
The second question.
Okay, using their skills and talents to follow their interests. Okay, and so how have you been able to do this in your program?
Most of the times we have an idea of what interest. We have volunteers, for example, that love to go to summer camp. So whenever you need a person to go, and if not summer camp, well, I'm gonna need someone for challenge camp. Those are the ones that come into mind because you know that that is what they enjoy doing. And some are only okay going or participating as a volunteer for 4HU because they prefer that setting. Or others are volunteers that just want to help with livestock projects. And that's where, I mean, you go and connect with them. And sometimes you already have them, you know, for years. Some of the volunteers have been helping with the program for a long time, and you have them. Now, it's harder sometimes to remember all the other things because this is a different year, but in a normal year, you just jump from one thing to the next, and then you forget sometimes that you need to follow up with them.
And how do you find out what role you need to place those volunteers in, Adriana?
I personally, we ask them, you know, when you have those parents that come to the office or that you connect with them because the kids come to project clubs and those are the first times that you start seeing those parents, just by talking, I guess, just engaging in conversations. That's how you find out what people like, what they want to do with the program, where they would like to do different things, what their skills are. It's just connecting through conversations. At least.
Yes, absolutely. So having those one-on-one conversations and developing that relationship, learning a little bit more about your volunteers and where they can be placed. So
yes, I don't think there's anything that will help more than just engaging and talking.
Mm-hmm. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Oh, no problem, Megan.
So when it comes to properly utilizing our volunteers, so things that we need to keep in mind, maintaining those open lines of two-way communication. So Adriana just shared, she's developing relationships with her volunteers. She's learning where they can effectively be placed to do their job well, or their role well, and then keeping them current on the situation that we're facing right now, or when we have program changes. If they're going to be working with our clientele, they're going to need that consistent, up-to-date information. I know everybody's been in that situation where like something changed and they didn't know it changed, and they went out and somebody knew before they did, and that can be a very uncomfortable situation. So keeping them in the know, and then finding ways to connect. And it doesn't, if we have some individuals that participate in the Lunch and Learn that are not as savvy with technology as some of us others are, and I don't think it really takes more than sometimes the telephones, email or the video chat. We don't always need these. Technology tools are wonderful and they're great, but sometimes an actual phone call may be all that's really needed. And then removing those barriers for your volunteers to lead. And the way that we remove barriers is we listen to what the needs of our volunteers are. What additional trainings do we need to allow them to lead effectively, and what resources? So that could be things, but that could be training, that could be people as well, are needed in order to allow them to effectively lead. And then developing that structure that allows them to lead programs. And so right now, the situation we're in, we have less and less opportunities to have those face-to-face contact, at times that might be unplanned. And so we need to really be strategic in the way that we communicate with them and that they can easily reach us. The last call, or the volunteer recruitment training that we just did, we talked a lot about setting boundaries. And I'm not one that says, oh, your phone needs to be on 24/7, but you do need to find a way where your volunteers can reach you if they need you, if something changes or if there's a situation that arises and they need to talk to you, being that you are the professional and you have a lot of times the answers they need. So how are you going to do that? Are you setting up a Microsoft Teams that some of our agents had mentioned? You know, we use Google Docs for a number of the contests for 4-HU, and that was really helpful for some of our volunteer judges that we just couldn't train in time to use Microsoft Teams, but that Google Doc folder had an easy way for them to just click a link and access the materials, as well as collaborative documents. And so how are you doing that, for developing that structure? Are you making volunteer teams? How are you checking in on them? And then in addition to that, allowing for timely and appropriate feedback. And as I've mentioned numerous times, that feedback should be two-way, where you're providing feedback for your volunteer, but they also have the opportunity to evaluate the program as well. And then we discussed communicating with your volunteers during the volunteer recruitment training, but I have this slide in here if you want to reference some of the tips that the other agents have provided and ways that they are going to have those two-way communication channels open going into the fall. So we discussed those virtual office hours, the team site, Google Classroom, monthly virtual volunteer conversations, GroupMe, various things. So I'll keep this slide on here. I sent a link out in the chat. You can access it. And then also a training link to how you can add guests to your Microsoft Teams. All right, next we're going to talk about delegation. So raise your hand if you have trouble delegating. 4, 5, 6, 10. We're going up, up, up. Okay, so a lot of us have trouble delegating. So I'll say that there's situations in my life where I've been like really a magnificent delegator, and there's many situations in my life where I've been pretty miserable at it. So if you could rate yourself at delegating tasks to your volunteers and others, would you rate yourself as magnificent, mixed, miserable, murky, or more if it's not, you don't think it's listed here? So share in the chat. Okay, so we've got some murkies. All right. Thank you for being honest, Victoria. Anybody else in the chat? Are you magnificent? Oh, a lot of mixed. That's good. That's good. We got murky, mixed, lots of mixed. Becoming mixed, murky, miserable. So who here agrees with me when it comes to delegating tasks? It depends on the tasks if we're magnificent or mixed, right? Yes, absolutely. Definitely agree. So let's talk about that. Let's why do we have difficulty delegating? Right, Lynette? Yeah. Why do we have difficulty delegating? Tell me why. What are some of the reasons? And sometimes we're really good at it, depending on if you know the task, and sometimes we're not. And why is that? Caitlin says it's afraid it will be done wrong and we'll have to redo it anyway. Catherine says we want it to be done right. We feel too far behind to ask for help. Victoria, yes. Adriana, will they do it the way we want it? Absolutely. Beth, because nobody can do it right. Exactly. You defined what's right. Monique said it's hard to give up control, like things done my way. I like things done my way too, and I totally understand. Camille said that perfectionist, so it's easier to sometimes do it myself than go back and forth with somebody else. Stephanie says miserable, and so is my spelling. I want it done my way and correctly. Thank you. And Charles says it depends on the task and I want it to be done correct. And Dr. Lepsley says, do we want it done right or just our way? Sometimes volunteers might have a better way. That's a very good point. So we talk about delegation and some of the reasons why we struggle with it. And y'all mentioned a lot of these, so I can do it better. I enjoy doing it and I don't want to give it up. So I think we all have these little things that we like to, that we're kind of passionate about doing. Like I love social media and I love to get in there, but I find that sometimes I spend a lot of time doing it when I probably should be delegating it in a previous role, I mean. Then people might wonder what I'm doing if I'm delegating the work to somebody else. The volunteer might be doing it better than I can. And then I'm responsible for the end result. And I think that comes to, you know, a lot of us have these, I won't say perfectionistic, but we want it to be done well and we want it to be done right, especially now in 4-H. If our name's going to be on something and we're responsible for that end result, we want to make sure that it looks good. And so I also struggle with that as well. And then I might lose control, right? So if I'm delegating tasks, I might lose control of those tasks. And I'm a perfectionist. I have, of course, past experience with delegation. So if you ever delegated a task and have it kind of blow up in your face, right? I'll say yes. And so in situations of delegation, a lot of times, and I'll say this, we default to these past experience and it clouds our judgment, I think, in the future. And when it comes to delegation, I think this is a situation where we do it. And so delegating responsibilities and having that kind of fear of that loss of contact as well. So I like to work with children, and I know that in 4-H we love working with youth. And so for delegating responsibilities, a lot of times that means that we have less, you know, actual contact with them, or we have less control. However, when we don't delegate, right, and we don't allow our volunteers to effectively lead, or we withhold information from them because of that fear of loss of control, you're limiting your volunteers' effectiveness. And they're not going to effectively do their job, and they're not going to be empowered and fill those leadership positions. And so we have to do a better job of overcoming that resistance and provide them with more opportunities to lead and serve. And to do that, obviously, we need to learn a little bit more about what delegation really means. And so there are kind of 4 ways that you can get the job done, right? So we can do it all of it, and kill ourselves every day. You know, I think we've all done that. We can direct others, so we can tell them when to do it. We can tell them how to do it. We can dump it on them, which, you know, is probably going to result in you know, nothing done well at that point. Or we can actually do a good job of actually delegating, which means having those mutually agreed upon results. So you're telling them what you want to happen in the end, rather than just giving them those actual tasks that need to be done. You sharing that authority, and you're providing that volunteer with the support that they actually need. And to know what support that volunteer needs, you actually have to have a good relationship with them. And also, one thing that I think is very important when it comes to delegating is having those communication channels open and regularly checking in on those volunteers. And so if it's a program that's really, really important to you and you have like a daily check-in, you know, maybe it's like just a 20 minutes, like how did it go? Those are really, really important so that the program stays on task and that you can find if there's any issues before they actually happen. And so learning how to effectively delegate and giving that appropriate level of authority, very, very important. What are the benefits to delegating tasks, right? So we have more time to do other things. We allow more people involved in achieving our 4-H mission, and then we grow our volunteer base and we empower others, right? So if we want to learn more about delegation, I'll say we only have an hour today. We're talking about utilization of volunteers, but we can dive into this and do a full workshop on it. So when we do our evaluation today, just tell me more. I think that when we look at being good volunteer managers, we need to understand that delegation is a really critical skill that we have to learn, and to develop, because as volunteer managers, we have to be good at empowering others to do tasks. So Charles had a couple of shares. We cannot do everything, so we have to strike a balance, absolutely. Lynette said clear communication, having relationships, knowing people's strengths is extremely important. And Charles said, if you're not delegating effectively, you're limiting the number of youth that are reaching, as well as the experience in their program. And so learning that delegating is not just giving tasks, but actually developing that relationship, having those, telling your volunteer what the results are, the goals of that program, giving them an appropriate level of authority, the support and training they need, and then having those check-in systems in place to make sure the job is getting done the way you want it. So keys to delegation and what it really means. All right, so talking about delegation, I think it's important that we discuss identifying those potential volunteers for leadership roles. I think it was a long time ago, but I had talked about a publication that I'd worked on with some coworkers at Miss USA called Identifying Potential Volunteer Leaders. And so we had grouped our volunteers in these 4 categories. Our ideal Ians, our trainable Tinas, our disruptive Dans, and our freeloading Freddies. So when you're ideal Ians, these are your volunteers that are skilled and they're motivated to work within the guidelines. Your trainable Tinas are motivated and willing to work, but they often lack the skills you need for them to assume those leadership roles. You have your disruptive Dans who have skills, but they are not going to work within the guidelines, and so they can be problematic. And then you have your freeloading Freddies that are sometimes disinterested, lack skills, might just be volunteering because their youth are involved or for some other reason. So when you're looking at these potential volunteer leaders, which are the ones that you're going to most likely put into a track, leadership track or a leadership role? So is it ideal Ian, trainable Tina, disruptive Dans? Anybody want to share in the chat? What about you, Charles? So which ones are we often going to put into leadership positions? Exactly, ideal Ian. And why are we going to train ideal Ian? We wear many hats, right? And we have limited amount of time. And then we look at ideal Ian and we recognize, oh, he's got leadership potential easily. I'm going to coach him and guide him and allow him to empower him and allow him to assume these leadership roles. So we're using a lot of our resources on training ideal Ian, right? Who should we also be investing in? And Charles said, trainable Tina, right? And so why should we be thinking about what are the benefits to training trainable Tina who lacks the leadership skills currently, but is motivated and willing to work within guidelines? So is it going to take us more time to train Tina, right? When you have time, I can train her. She wants to help. She's motivated to help. Exactly, thank you. And you can provide her with the proper training. And so there's also additional benefits to working with our trainable Tinas, which obviously takes us a little bit more time because she's currently lacking those leadership skills. However, she's motivated and she's willing to work. So trainable Tinas can create greater opportunities for your 4-H programs because they exhibit those leadership potential characteristics. However, they don't have them yet. And so if you're finding your trainable TINAs and you're investing time in them, what you can do is you can actually motivate your entire volunteer base this way. If you're training trainable TINAs, you're creating this belief that your volunteers can make valuable contributions to your program. And in saying that, if your trainable TINAs are being trained beyond just your ideal Ians, you have an opportunity to motivate your disruptive Dans, your freeloading Freddies, potentially increasing the productivity, then buy-in of your entire volunteer population. But we sometimes often neglect the trainable TINAs, and we neglect them for a reason that Stephanie mentioned in the chat, and which I'm glad she mentioned it, because they take more time to develop. And it's much easier to work with our ideal Ians, all right, because they often exhibit these leadership skills. However, our trainable TINAs, as we know, could be well connected, and they're motivated, and they potentially are, believe in the 4-H program, in the mission, but with some encouragement, some investment in that relationship and in their skills, and one-on-one, maybe coaching and mentoring, potentially could make yourself some trainable TINAs that become volunteer leaders as well. And then Stephanie said, we give them confidence when we assure them that we can train them. Yes. And then other volunteers are also looking at this, understanding that, trainable TINA might not be a part of this elite volunteer leader group, I guess, that, we often flock to when they come to our organization. However, if we're investing in other volunteers too, a lot of our entire volunteer base is going to take notice. So there's a publication on this. I'll share the link in the chat if you want to look at it a little bit further, about investing in some of those volunteers that don't often exhibit those leadership skills, but are motivated to help and willing to work, but they do sometimes take a little bit more time to train and develop. All right, so some volunteer utilization tips that we're discussing, some of these we've discussed today, but working closely with our volunteer teams. So leaders must serve, right? So we're in order to be effective leaders, we need to allow others to lead. So we talked about, delegating tasks to our volunteers, setting these clear expectations. So I'll often mention these position descriptions and volunteer contracts. Do we have them in place? Are we referring back to those? So do our volunteers know what's expected of us? And so are we clearly communicating those expectations consistently with them? If we don't have two-way communication that's being developed, then we're not doing that well. Having those regular meetings, and they could just be those touch-based check-ins. They don't, need to be have a whole lot of structure to them, but having that conversation of just what are your needs, how are things going, what are the results, how can I assist you, what additional training is needed. And then looking for other leadership or training opportunities even outside of the organization. So if you see something where you think your volunteers might benefit, sharing it with them, and they will also, I think, appreciate that. You're investing in them in their roles of leader with your organization. And then recognizing that your volunteers are sacrificing time. Okay, so it talks about how you treat your volunteers matters. So how do we treat them? Are we treating them like a low-level employee and kind of keeping them in the dark? Or are we actually understanding that they're out here giving their time to support our programs, and we respect them for it? We often tell them that we appreciate that for them doing that. We talk a lot about volunteer recognition, but how you treat your volunteers, do you treat them with respect? Do you allow them to have a voice in your program? That matters, especially when it comes to retention. And as I often say, giving them a voice in your program and they have perspective that it can allow us to really improve. And so I hope that hopefully that you are allowing them to have some say-so in the direction of your program and how it's going. All right, so I have Charles I've got 2 more slides, Charles, if that's okay with you. I'm going quick. Okay, thanks.
Sure, go ahead.
Great. So we're going to move on, and Charles is going to take it away for us in a minute. So I wanted to do, before we kind of moved into that, once again, real low tech, we're going to get a pen and pencil and some paper. So yes, no, and somewhat. I want to evaluate our program's ability to facilitate virtual and remote volunteers. All right, so the first question, you want you to answer yes, no, or somewhat. Do most volunteers have regular access to a telephone with internet and or a computer? And you might not know this, so you could say somewhat or no. Question 2, can most volunteers be easily reached by email, text, and telephone? Do we have good contact information right now with our volunteers? Yes, no, somewhat. Number 3, can you be easily reached by email, text, or telephone? Yes, no, or somewhat. Question 4, do most volunteers have access to the technology needed to perform virtual duties? Yes, no, somewhat. Question 5, have you asked your volunteers how they can help and what their availability is at this time? Hopefully we've already done this. Yes, no, or somewhat. Or we might not be able to do that yet, and I guess we should consider that. And then question 6, have you identified short and long-term programs or projects that can be worked on virtually or remotely? Yes, no, or somewhat. And I have a link at the bottom if you want to do this virtual assessment, the little bit longer one, there's a link on the slide as well. So does anybody want to share their results with me? So how many yeses, how many nos, how many somewhats? Anybody? So how many yeses, how many nos, how many somewhats? Okay, so 4 yeses and 2 somewhats. So that's good. Making progress. 3 somewhats, 3 yeses. I think that's good. 4 yeses, 2 somewhat. Okay. Denise, do you want to tell us what your somewhats were? Or Stephanie? Or Victoria?
So my somewhats would be the 5 and the 6, just because I know the first 4 yeses for sure, but the 5 and the 6 is what we're still working on a little bit right now.
And that's probably because the situation in with your program, you're just not sure where your volunteer needs are. Just okay.
Yeah,
great.
We're just not sure yet.
And I think that's important to note. So some of us haven't gotten there yet, and you know our programs, the way they're going to look. So we're not quite sure what we need availability-wise. So we haven't been able to identify those short and long-term programs or projects that can be worked on virtually or remotely. And I think that's important to acknowledge, but understand that at one point we're gonna need to do that as well. So thank y'all for sharing. So Charles is going to take it away in just a second. I know that you have the slides, but we talk about virtual volunteer duties and roles for 4-H. So we've got just kind of a long list of things that volunteers can do for our programs in a virtual environment. And I shared this nice little visual that I borrowed from Give Pulse, but just basically a quick summary. You know, we have a volunteer that loves serving. You know, she's told, well, you can't serve right now because of COVID-19, and she's pretty upset. But then she finds out that there's ways that she can serve remotely, and she's pretty excited about that. So understanding that volunteers, when they're motivated, they will find a way to serve. And so how are we fulfilling that need? And are we offering them opportunities to stay connected, even if it's just in an advisory committee role or an advisory role? And so just in brainstorming opportunities for your volunteers, you can use this nice visual, or you can kind of work with your team to identify some of those virtual or remote opportunities that might exist, even if they're non-traditional. All right, so I think Charles is going to take away now. He's going to talk more about effectively assessing what our volunteer needs are. I'm going to let you take it away, Charles. You got the mic now. So.
All right, thanks, Megan. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with all of you. We've been actively engaged with volunteers in the Lafayette program. I've been here 26 years, and since the beginning, volunteers have been an active role in our program. And as we're talking about volunteers, realize we're facing an extraordinary year. So how can we assess various groups and organizations, pieces of the puzzle, more or less, that need to be involved in your program as we begin this year? So who are some of those clientele groups that you feel you need to solicit information from as we begin the school year, because we need buy-in? So who are those people? And if you could create a list in the chat of who some of those people or groups of people may be that you think can definitely help you lead your program into a new direction. And some of them have great skills that could assist you in this time of need. So anyone want to share some of those groups of people? Okay, school leaders, club leaders, that's correct. What are other groups of people that may be able to help you? So just give you a couple of minutes. Council members, school system, parents, yes, okay. IT people are essential, very important group of people that we need to have on board. So in developing a plan, you'll see on your slide, definitely we need to start with a system administration, and some of you have multiple system administrations in your parishes. So that may mean multiple meetings. I mean, for us, there is the Lafayette Parish School System, and so we've met with their administration. I did share an agenda with y'all earlier in the chat. You may be able to use part of it if you have not met with yours, and if you have, it's okay. There may be an opportunity for another meeting, okay? Realize they're strapped for time as well. But a couple of key points from that agenda is sharing our parish profile of programs from this past year. The letter of authorization, we get one signed from the school system superintendent each year. And then your cooperative agreement is pretty much how that meeting begins. From there, we talked about truly having a part in the school system as they begin this extraordinary year, because we want to be part of the school system, because even though they have academic roles and teach classes, realize they still want that opportunity for us in the system to be able to teach those soft skills, leadership development, and service for their youth in the school system. So all of those were key points when we met with the school system. And so they did mention they want us in the school system. They want us to be a part. Just realize it may be a little slower than normal this school year. So in this meeting, I mean, we're not going to start club meetings, even though they're going to be virtually, till the month of October. Then you talk about teacher focus groups. That was the next thing we did, and that was meeting with key teachers or key components of our program. And for us, elementary and middle school teachers were one group because their schedules were very similar. Then elementary was by themselves, and then middle and high school was together because their schedules were very similar. And I included an agenda of us meeting with those folks in here, and kind of went through our meeting with the superintendent, gave our office more information than the teachers had when we started these meetings. So the teachers felt like our meeting with them was more informative than they had received from their administrators at the point probably several weeks ago that we had these meetings. From there, we also shared the framework and we sent them a copy. And then from there, the results of the survey that were collected from our parents, what I would call parish elected officials, and then also students. And then you'll see in that list, there's a group of questions we asked all the teachers in developing a plan for our program. And our school system will be on Google Classroom, and we will serve as a co-host in the Google Classroom with the teacher leader serving as the host. So all the liability is still in the school system. That's why we are not an essential component of that. We don't have our own Lafayette Parish School System account. In addition to that, we've had those meetings with elementary, middle, and high school, and then school gardens. So really, we developing 3 plans, but all the regular or traditional 4-H club organizational leader plans are very similar. And then from there, our next step is to develop an advisory meeting of volunteer development, which includes organizational leaders, parent leaders, and youth. So that would be the our officers or our junior leader group. So that steering committee will help us develop a plan and know where we're headed into the school system as we begin this year, then marketing that plan to administrators and all of our organizational leaders, then sending that plan out to all of our previous 4-H families, and then going to social media and your news media. So everyone in the community kind of has an idea of how 4-H will work, because it's going to be delayed. Some of our people will be a bit confused, but it's going to be okay. We're going to work through the plan. And this week, our school system has I would say a revision or a 2.0 plan now. Our elementary schools were going to start out on AB days and go that way through at least the first 9 weeks. That plan changed Tuesday morning, and they're going to start out the first week on AB to get everyone oriented. And then after that point, all elementary schools will be 5 days a week. So our initial plan is already emerging and somewhat being tweaked based on what we originally thought as to where we are now, and realize we all are going to have to be very flexible as we develop these plans and phases, because it's going to continue to change. So with that being said, does anyone want to either share in the chat or comment on your mic? What is a volunteer? I mean, what do you think when you think of a volunteer definition? Anyone want to share? Okay, youth and adults who want to contribute, someone who gives their time and or an activity. Okay, sure, those are all correct answers. So I realize a volunteer is defined as an individual who contributes their time of their own free will, and hopefully we consider that person to be a caring, compassionate adult, willing to serve or give back to their community. It's free. So yes, Camille mentioned unpaid. So sometimes not everyone understands that, what a volunteer is, and sometimes we need to let them know and make that clear. And then initially they need to officially enroll through our 4-H volunteer enrollment system. And hopefully each parish is going to give them some type of training or onboarding, regardless if it's virtual, if it's in a conversation. Now realize there's different ways of onboarding based on what their task is that volunteer will be serving. So what can volunteers be used for in your program? And we're going to, I mean, it could be basic, a traditional year, or it can be during a pandemic. Some of these roles will be a little different, and that's okay. But does anyone want to share some of the roles that volunteers can be used to conduct in a pandemic? In the chat? Yes. Okay. Judges, that can be virtual. You can give them virtual submissions. Project leader for small groups. Assist with setting up contest days. Realize these are all key points for us to realize, and we need to try and figure out what our parish needs are, and from there match the individual volunteer's skill with our program needs. And here's some volunteer ways that volunteers can be used. You'll talk about help with presentations, videos. Tanya mentioned that in the chat. Volunteer meeting moderator. Ms. Ruby led Teams technology training. So here are some suggestions, but an organizational leader at a school, a contest judge, project book coordinator. Realize this is something that we've been doing for years. We have a couple of volunteers. Once our enrollment cards are in, they come in and pull all our books and bundle them up. That'll be a little bit delayed this year, but we feel, just like we're doing with everyone else in the office, taking temperatures every day, we feel that we can still probably do that in a month. Have them fill enrollment cards once we have those cards in. You know, there are various skills. We say, for example, a bookkeeper. If there's someone, another parent or two that are willing to work with club officers in a virtual setting, as long as we have too deep leadership, I think those things are very possible. If you have leaders that are looking at, they have good writing skills or marketing skills or IT skills, can they help put together your newsletter or do some videos of things that are happening at the school? Send them to us so we can put them on our webpage. Realize they need to be ADA compliant, and we can do that. Or in some cases, maybe some of our secretaries can assist with that. So there's many different roles that can be achieved. It can be service learning. So someone or a parent at the school may be able to help in a different role virtually to create ways that clubs can get involved in service learning. If they used to go to the nursing home, maybe a parent can volunteer to pick up cards from the students at school and just deliver them to the nursing home. It may not be to the same level, but realize, as Lynette mentioned, there are endless possibilities. We just need to create the safe environment that our youth can get involved in, because it's going to be different this year. So where they talked about going into the hospital, realize they can still conduct the service. It won't be as personal as it used to be, but realize all those frontline workers, if it's thank you cards, if it's putting signs outside the hospitals or doctor's office, etc. There are still many ways that our youth can get involved in service that will help realize that can go back to their leadership as well as community service. And then realize if they're doing books next summer, we would probably see a little decrease in some of this at the beginning of the school year, but hopefully we will be able to pick back up and engage these opportunities throughout the spring where some of our youth can get involved. But these are all just examples of things that can be utilized both in a traditional setting or in virtual times. But as Dr. Lepley mentioned, take over 4-H clubs and manage a club. You may have someone just to work with the officers of a club. Just realize we still need 2 deep leadership, but if that's a couple of parents that want to help the school leader, or can do it by phone call and some of our high school kids, they can even call each other. So it doesn't have to be an adult. It can be a youth volunteer in many of these roles. So the keys to a successful 4-H volunteer program is building relationships, and that's continuously, not just in the time of need when we need those volunteers, empowering them and then supporting them. So when you talk about identifying, we talk about selecting volunteers. We want to give them definition or define their role or a job description, understanding the benefits for both the volunteer as well as us, the staff. So we are on, Megan talked about earlier, clear communication, identifying and understanding volunteer motivation. Some people need different types of motivation. So if y'all want to mention in the chat, what type of motivation do you appreciate? Another thing you can do is ask volunteers maybe what's their birthday month. Realize volunteers want to be recognized. So even if it's a card, something personal, just realize this all ties into that building that relationship with that volunteer so that they may remain engaged in your program. And in turn, this volunteer will recruit other volunteers for you where they find they've had a meaningful role or experience with other volunteers. In many cases, that may shift up to some of our volunteers becoming a middle manager to be able to recruit other people. And when you lead into recruitment, there's a couple of key things you need to do. They're not hard tasks, okay? First, many people are afraid to do the asking. So we need to ask. The worst thing you could be told is no, and it's okay. So sometimes we need to figure out how to best place that volunteer. Current volunteers are the best people to use as our recruiters. So we want to use the current people that are involved in your program that have had that meaningful experience. And then you want to target people that you know, that you're already involved in the program. But there will be some new people that come along, and we just need to ask them. Realize we can go back to that enrollment card. The enrollment card asks several, for example, project areas. So if you think you need someone in a specific project area, use the data you have or you will be collecting this fall to place those people. So those are all key points that can be made. I guess, do any of you have any questions about volunteers, engaging volunteers, or specifically how do you go about doing this in a pandemic? And it's all about building that relationship, not just when you want them. You want to build that relationship throughout the entire year so that volunteer doesn't just know you coming to them and asking them for something else. So if they know you're committed to your program, they will definitely be willing, because they know they have the support to help you in any role possible. So thank y'all. Appreciate it. The opportunity to share.
Thanks, Charles. And if you have more questions, comments for Charles, you can share those in the chat. We were obviously really short on time, so I wanted to run through just a couple of tools for you. And Charles mentioned a couple of these. That electronic volunteer enrollment form can help you in matching the volunteers to your program needs. There's a lot of questions in there. If you dive deep into what your volunteers are saying when they're enrolling, they can help you and your programs and find out where those volunteers fit. So I encourage you to use that form to allow you to put your volunteers in the roles where they can be effective. We did create a sample virtual volunteer position description in that Teams folder. Shared again how to access that. It's a resource sharing team, so it's optional if you want to be added. And also we created a 4-H volunteers can lead virtual programs guide, and it's and I'll share that for you in just a second. All right, so it's just a quick document about the technology tools that we can use. Obviously, the volunteers might be more versed in Zoom or Google Classroom, just depending on what their school is using or what they have access to. It does dive into a little bit more about Teams and using Teams, because that's the platform that we've been using. So if they're gonna have to learn to use Teams, it does provide them with some information on how to access it. It talks about risk management in a virtual environment, leadership, preparing for meetings, exiting meetings the right way. It also has how to host the virtual meetings. So it talks about icebreakers, the pledge, your agenda, providing opportunities for youth to share, voting, and various things. And then there's also some additional resources. So, icebreakers, different components of virtual meetings, working with some of these technology tools, also Zoom tutorials, Google Classroom tutorials. And then Ruby Miller had provided some material on preparing virtual presentations. It's also very good, and I've included those resources as well. So share these with there's a lot of material being produced for volunteers right now. This is just one of many. But if you think this will be effective or helpful for them, feel free to share that. All right, and then I also wanted to share another thing that I thought was really might be effective. Kind of running over time, but I'm gonna go to my Teams for a second. All right. I guess I'm not going to my Teams. I'm sharing the wrong screen, sorry. All right, here we go. I've been hearing on one of the calls that I was on recently, we talked about managing large volunteer events. So these are not maybe your ongoing volunteer opportunities, but when you actually have, a big program where you need quite a few volunteers to help. Somebody mentioned Sign Up Genius, and I think Sign Up Genius is really good for signing up for things, but there's a lot of other tools that could be effectively used. And so this one platform called Give Pulse is the one that's recognized by the Carnegie Foundation. I used it for Egg Magic, and it was really effective. Obviously, we had to cancel it, but I started kind of building the shifts out for next year's, and I really like it because it creates, those multiple shifts for you to kind of view, or your volunteers could sign up for. It breaks them out for you. It allows you to document, how many people have signed up for each shift. And then if you click on it, it talks a little bit more about it, but it's more specific to volunteering and service. And it sends out those automatic reminders to your volunteers. It allows you to input surveys, allows them to log their impact. And it's still free, so there's a free version of it, just like there is a free version of Sign Up Genius. You just kind of have to toggle a little bit. It also has some, message registration, poll reports, manage those different registrations, sign up groups as well. It has waivers embedded and various things that we need when we're working with volunteers. So if you have a virtual event and you have a lot of volunteer shifts that you're trying to fill, this could be a helpful resource in that. I would suggest you look at it versus using something like a Sign Up Genius, but that's just my perspective. If you want to dive into it a little more, I'd be willing to kind of show you around at any point. So just wanted to share that. Obviously, for some parts of our program, that might be a helpful thing to use. All right, so we're kind of at the end. I do have a evaluation that I'll share in the chat, so if you could feel free to complete that, like we do for all of our Lunch and Learns. We do have a digital badge as well. I have a little bit of a conflict with that September Lunch and Learn date that we had originally scheduled. I had part of my doctoral program, I had a research seminar that the schedule changed due to COVID-19, so I have a situation there. So I wanted to ask some potential suggested dates for that and times that wouldn't conflict with everybody's schedule. So please complete that evaluation. Help me out there. A lot of the additional resources that you can access, I will share this in the chat again so you have it. And then if you're looking for previous session materials, they can be found at the link on the screen, and I'll send that out again in the email. If you have any more questions, Charles and I will stay on the call for a minute, just wanting to be mindful of time, knowing that you have a 2-hour workshop this afternoon. We only went 2 hours over today, so that was pretty good. All right, well, thank y'all. I appreciate y'all for participating today on such a busy Thursday. So feel free to ask questions if you have it on your way out.